Oh, dear Lord, dear Father, I just thank you so much that we can gather here today, Lord, and learn more about your word. Lord, I just pray right now, Lord, that you speak through me, Lord, that you would help me to speak clearly, Lord, and you give me clarity of thoughts, that you would just calm my mind. Help me not to be nervous, Lord. And I pray, Lord, that you touch hearts, Lord, that your word would be received, and everyone would be able to apply these things to their lives, Lord, and that we would just be able to walk out of here and grow closer with you, Lord. I just thank you so much for this church and how you bless us so much. And I just ask and pray right now that you bless this message. Amen. All right, turn your Bibles to the first chapter of Esther. We're starting a new book tonight. And this study is going to be a little different than the last two studies were in Zechariah, because Esther is a very different book than the book of Zechariah. And I would like tonight to set down, to introduce the book and then give us some historical context as well for the next month and a half while we're in the book of Esther. And I don't think that we're going to get through chapter 2 entirely, but I would like to get somewhat through chapter 2 so we're within range of chapter 4 next week. So first of all, let's introduce the book. The events in the book of Esther take place in Persia, not Jerusalem, or Israel for that matter, and they largely take place in the city of Susa, also known as Shushan, the capital or a capital city of the Persian Empire. And this book takes place over the course of a course of about 10 years. And if you were to read it from beginning to end, it doesn't seem like 10 years take place, but just realize that a lot of these years pass in between chapters. We're going to see like Esther becomes queen, and then there's a span of time in between where the next event picks up and whatnot. But from 483 BC to roughly 473 BC, that's the span of time that we have for this book. And these dates put the book of Esther in the 70-year period in between the completion of the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem in the book of Ezra and the completion of the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, which occurs in the book of Nehemiah. So we have in chronological order the completion of the temple in 515 BC, and then over in Persia we have the events of Esther take place in 483 to 473 BC, followed by the walls being completed in 443 BC. Also, during this time, groups of Jews begin to return from their captivity when they were taken captive by Babylon. And this begins with the group of Jews that go before and build the temple, followed by two more groups of Jews after the book of Ezra, which will go back before the walls are completed. Now, who wrote the book of Esther, and when was it written? Well, it's hard to say exactly for either of these two questions, but I think that we can narrow it down quite a bit. The book seems to have been written sometime after the king Ahasuerus' death. And he's going to be a character in this story, and you will get to know him quite a bit more. But he died in 465 BC. And we assume this because of the way that he is introduced in the past tense in the first two verses of the book, which read, verse 1, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel." So it almost reads like they're introducing you to someone who's no longer there, who's passed on, and this was who this guy was. Also, we assume that the book could have not been written any later than 300 BC because of the lack of Greek words that are used in the original text. And as we know, Alexander the Great defeated the Persians in 331 BC and then went on to conquer the entire Persian kingdom after that. After this, Greek culture permeated the entire area that we're talking about here. So if it was written during this time or afterwards, we would see Greek words popping up in the original text, and they don't. For example, the book of Esther refers to King Ahasuerus by his Hebrew name. The Greeks, however, knew him, and Western culture today knows him as King Xerxes. Also, the intricate details given within the book, such as the names of the king's 7 advisors and his 7 eunuchs, suggest that the book was written by someone who witnessed these events personally, or someone who knew someone who witnessed the events personally. Now this leads us to the question of who wrote the book. Although there is no author given here, we can assume that a Jew who lived through these events, or one who knew someone who lived through these events, wrote Esther. I have two main people that may have written the book. The first is Mordecai, and he's one of the main characters in this story. Or Nehemiah, who later presided over the building of Jerusalem's walls, and he also acted as King Artaxerxes' cupbearer in Persia, so he would have had access to this information about the story. So flip a coin. Most likely it was Mordecai, because we see in chapter 9, verse 29 through 30, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth. This book may be one of those letters that Mordecai and Esther sent to the provinces. Or perhaps it's most likely Nehemiah, who wrote the book because there's no real insight into the first-person mind that Mordecai might have given. We don't see any of his thought processes, and there's no first-person references, so perhaps it's Nehemiah. But that's beside the point. But regarding the content of Esther, there are some interesting aspects to this book of Esther. You see, despite the fact that we see God's hand at work throughout this story, this book never explicitly mentions God. And despite the fact that we see Mordecai in sackcloth and mourning, and Esther calling for a fast of all the Jews during their time of need, this book never mentions prayer. Now, due to the lack of these two qualities, along with the absence of any noted sins on the part of Esther or Mordecai, it is really difficult to determine the depth of these two individuals' spiritual walk. Also, as another interesting note, the book of Esther is never mentioned in the New Testament. This is very much a standalone book, and it's very important because if the book of Esther were not in the Bible, we would have no way of knowing about these events. So let's get into the scripture. Verse 1, Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces, from India to Ethiopia, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel. That in the 3rd year of his reign he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Now, if we may have the first slide up here. Understand that at this point, King Ahasuerus is a relatively new king, his father Darius having died 3 years previous. And we have this new king in control of this humongous landmass. You see over there in the east, on your guys' right side, it stretches all the way to India. And down here it hits, in Africa, it hits Ethiopia. And in order to better govern this humongous land, it was divided into 127 different provinces. And the king is wining and dining the nobles and commanders of each of these provinces for 180 days. Now, whether they were all there for the entire duration of the feast, or if the king hosted smaller groups in shorter expanses of time so that the whole period of feasting added up to 180 days, with the entire kingdom attending at some point, we don't know. However, one way or another, this was a tremendous endeavor, and we will see tonight just what the king's motives were for holding it. But eventually the feast ended, and what does the king do? Well, he holds another feast. Let's see in verse 5, it says, And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods, and marble pillars. And the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all of the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. Now I get the picture, beginning here and running throughout the book, that the king treated his subjects and servants fairly well. I mean, just imagine how you'd feel about your boss if they threw a 7-day-long office Christmas party, beginning with a secret Santa where everyone was gifted a one-of-a-kind pure gold goblet to drink from. However, we see here in verse 9 that things take a turn for the worse. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So at this point in the story, we see that the king is drunk, or at least getting drunk, and he wants to bring his queen out to show how beautiful she is to all the people, because a lot of them might have not even seen her before. But the queen refuses. Now, why did Queen Vashti refuse? I get the impression that her behavior stemmed from pride and possibly her having her own fair share of wine as well. Kind of a how dare he boss me around in front of my female subjects type of attitude. However, Josephus, a Jewish historian who lived during the time of Christ, claims that the queen refused to appear before the king because of Persian laws, which forbid the wives to be seen by strangers. And if this is the case, then perhaps Vashti had some merit to her objection. Understand that in Persia during this time, the law superseded the will and power of the king. Now, some more modern scholars give Vashti tons of credit here because they feel that Ahasuerus was commanding her to appear before the servants and residents of the city nude. Now, this is not stated in the Bible, and I reject it. I mean, it does say that Vashti was to appear wearing her royal crown. So unless the king just sought to humiliate her, we must reject this last possibility. Understand, however, just how big of a deal this was. Queen Vashti did not have any prerogative or entitlement to refuse the king, especially in front of their subjects. As the queen, Vashti was doubly inclined to obey the king. First, she was his wife, and wives in ancient Persia were akin to chattel. They certainly did not exist as equals in a relationship. Second, as the queen, Vashti could expect to be summoned and dismissed at the king's leisure, leading to sudden inconveniences and long spells of isolation. For example, we will see later on in chapter 4, when Esther needed to speak desperately with the king, she was worried because she had not been summoned for 30 days even to see him. This was the price of being the queen. Also, refusing the request of the king, especially publicly, equated to foolhardiness because you were openly disrespecting the most powerful man in the world. One could expect dire consequences for this type of flippant behavior. We will see that Esther, once she had become queen, hesitated even to approach the king without an invitation, because unless the king immediately held out his scepter towards her, she would be put to death. Not to mention, ancient secular sources make sure to let us know that King Ahasuerus had a bit of a temper. On one occasion, when the Persian army was having trouble building a bridge over the Hellespont River, Ahasuerus ordered that his taskmasters go down and whip the water itself because it refused to obey him. But for whatever reason, Queen Vashti allowed herself to demonstrate the validity of Proverbs 16, verse 18. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now let's move on to verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew the law and justice, those being closest to him being Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. What shall we do to the queen Vashti according to the law, because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus brought to her by the eunuchs? This is what he asked them. So here we see the king paying deference to the law of the land, which was the ultimate authority. But do they find a law that applies? Well, let's see. In Esther 16, it says, and Memucan answered before the king and princes. He said, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes, and all the people who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus, there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and Medes, so that it will not be altered. That's important, that it will not be altered. That Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout his entire empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. So here we're getting a little bit of a peek into the marriage status in the Persian Empire at this time. And we also see that rather than finding a law that applied, they simply made one up that fit their desires. Now, does that sound familiar today? In Esther chapter 1, verse 21, it reads, "And the reply pleased the king and the princes, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house, and speak in the language of his own people." So we see here at the end of chapter 1 that there will be no women's liberation movement beginning anytime soon in Persia. More importantly, though, we have just looked at the event that God is going to use to place a godly woman into power that he can use to bless and protect his people in multiple ways for the duration of the Persian Empire. Now let's get into chapter 2. After these things, when the wrath of Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Now the phrase "after these things" refers to an undisclosed passage of time between chapter 1 and chapter 2. It is in fact roughly 3 years that passes in between these two chapters, and I'd like to elaborate a bit on what exactly happened during this period. First of all, understand that King Ahasuerus was not holding a 180-day feast for no particular reason. But to better understand this, let's go back to the reign of Ahasuerus' father, King Darius. Now, if I may have image 2 up. You see, in these later years, King Darius reigned over a Persian empire very similar in size and scope to the one ruled over by his son. But all was not well. Let's see if I can work this thing. Up here in the northwest, these recently conquered Greek city-states which occupied the very fringe of the empire were beginning to rebel and show signs of unrest. And in 491 BC, King Darius sent envoys to demand that the Greeks submit to Persian rule. And some did. However, Athens and Sparta executed the envoys. Now this amounted to an act of war. And the following year, Darius sent a force of 25,000 men and 600 ships to attack the Greek city-states. But the Greeks banded together and, on the plains of Marathon, defeated King Darius' force. Now, as you can imagine, Darius was furious. And he now determined to bring the whole power of this Persian Empire against these puny little Greek city-states and reconquer his lost land. But as he was beginning to set out, Egypt in the south revolted as well, forcing Darius to reverse his course and deal with that first. However, on his way there, he died. And in 486 BC, Ahasuerus, his son, took the throne. Therefore, when King Ahasuerus took the throne, he had 2 of his father's unfinished tasks to complete. Put down the Egyptian uprising, and then number 2, go get revenge upon the Greeks. The first task proved to be no problem. He simply took control of his father's army and moved south and stamped out the rebellion. However, the army soon needed to be disbanded for logistical reasons. It's hard to feed that many people for that amount of time, especially back then. And this is why he's holding a 180-day feast for all of the important people of his empire. He's reforming his military force by drumming up support for the invasion of Greece and extracting pledges for supplies and manpower from the representatives of different regions within his land. And while they are feasting in Susa, King Ahasuerus has crews in the northwest building bridges over rivers so that a large army can march across them without any delay. And while they're feasting on the coast, they're building ships so that when he sets out, he will be met by a navy of 1,200 warships, which will sail parallel to his force as they move up the coast, putting down city after city who dared to separate themselves from the Persian Empire. And that's exactly what he's doing in this portion of time in between chapters 1 and chapter 2. That is, until he reaches the pass of Thermopylae. Now if we could have image 3. So this is the route he takes, just destroying all of the cities that dared to oppose his father and him. However, when he got to Thermopylae, he got there and he had a massive force, a massive Persian army. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus estimates that Ahasuerus' force numbered about 2.6 million men. Another ancient source, Simonides, claims that the Persian force contained 4 million men. However, modern historians temper these numbers down quite a bit, estimating that the number was more in the ballpark of 150,000 men, which is still a huge army at this time. And I actually think that for once, modern historians might be closer to the mark here. However, when these 150,000 Persians reached Thermopylae, they found themselves opposed by a mixture of only 7,000 Greek soldiers and hoplites, which included a force of 300 Spartans. And perhaps you've already guessed it, but about 10 or 15 years ago, an incredibly popular movie called 300 came out, and this event is what the movie portrayed. However, the pass of Thermopylae was incredibly narrow, only about 30 meters wide at some points, and the Persians had no room to maneuver or take advantage of their larger numbers. Just imagine trying to march 150,000 men down a 30-meter wide corridor. To exacerbate this, the Spartans chose to make their stand against the Persians at the narrowest point. And they stood shoulder to shoulder, holding their oversized shields so that they overlapped with the shield of their neighbor next to them, forming a wall from head to toe. So when the Persians attacked them, they just stood still, bracing their shield with one hand and thrusting their spear over the top of it with the other. And because of the gap in the pass was so narrow, the Spartans were able to rotate units in and out of this battle line, so that whenever someone got tired, they could catch their breath while a fresh soldier took their place. And in this manner, ancient sources tell us that the first wave of Ahasuerus' army, some 10,000 Persians, were completely wiped out at the cost of only 2 or 3 Greeks. Now eventually, after 3 days, Ahasuerus found another way around the pass and was able to advance, but not before he lost 20,000 troops. Couple this with the fact that 2 separate storms hit his fleet and destroyed over 400 of his ships, followed by a naval battle near Salamis where he lost another 300 ships. Now, with his navy in shambles and his army demoralized, Ahasuerus began to fear that he would be cut off from his homeland. So he took a portion of his army and returned home. However, on the way, the majority of his soldiers with him died from hunger and disease, while the force he left behind in Greece was destroyed in subsequent battles, as well as his navy. And thus, King Ahasuerus returned to Persia, completely defeated. He had no military to secure his empire. He had squandered his supplies on a failed invasion, and the money was gone as well. And then he began to long for the companionship of his former wife, Queen Vashti. And this is where we enter in chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of the king Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." Enter Esther. In verse 5 we see, in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Babylon or from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So here we are introduced to our two main characters of this book, and we see a tender family bond between the two. Esther is an orphan in a foreign land, adopted and raised by her older cousin Mordecai, all the while being under the watchful eye of a caring God. Psalm 27:10 states, "When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me." Also, we see in the prayer of Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 8, it says, "He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the beggar from the ash heap to set them among princes, to make them inherit the throne of glory." Now, we don't really get any direct lineage for Esther in this verse here, but we see Mordecai's family traced back 3 generations to Kish, a Benjamite. Now, this is not the first time that we see the son of Kish, a Benjamite, in the Word of God. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, it says, "There was a man of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becheroth, the son of Ephi, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people." Now, I'm not sure how handsome Mordecai was, but it's fair to assume that we are dealing with a descendant of King Saul. And here we see that Kish, the great-grandfather of Mordecai, had been carried away by the Babylonians. So this makes Mordecai and Esther 4th-generation refugees in a foreign land. Also, understand that the name Kish means bow. So whether this bow is sending out his son Saul to find 2 lost donkeys, which ultimately ends up in Saul becoming the king of Israel, or if it's a bow sending out his descendants into captivity, which ultimately leads to Esther becoming the queen of the Persian Empire, I think it's safe to say that God works in mysterious ways. And in verse 8, "So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther was also taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women." Now, some Bible scholars, some Bible teachers say that Mordecai, at this point in his life, is not walking in the will of God, that he's walking in sin. And one reason that they give is that Mordecai did not return to Jerusalem with the other Jews who returned to rebuild the temple some 35 years before. Another reason that they give that Mordecai might be walking in sin is that he allows Esther here to participate in this event listed, where the best case scenario was that Esther would become the wife of a pagan king, and the worst case scenario and the more likely scenario was that she will be relegated to the king's harem as a concubine, which was what happened to all of the other women who did not get selected as the queen. And a third reason that they give, is, as we will see, is that Mordecai told Esther not to reveal that she was a Jew to anybody. Now, this last one I'll deal with in a little bit, but I want to deal with the first 2 reasons why people might think that Mordecai is walking in sin right now. Regarding Mordecai not returning Jerusalem, understand that there are recorded in the Bible 3 occasions where large groups of Jews returned from Jerusalem from their captivity, and that 2 of these 3 occasions took place after the events in Esther, so he couldn't have joined those. The only other group that Mordecai could have joined happened in 538 BC, nearly 60 years before we are introduced to Mordecai here. He probably had not even been born at this time. Now perhaps we can fault him for not setting out on his own as a young man to return to Jerusalem, but understand that the distance between Jerusalem and where he lived in Susa is 848 6.5 miles in a straight line amid arid terrain. That is the equivalent of walking from Tijuana, Mexico to Eugene, Oregon amid harsh desert conditions. Also understand that God knew that Mordecai needed to stay in Susa in order to raise up and protect his still unborn cousin Esther. Therefore, we cannot fault Mordecai here. Now, concerning the issue of Esther participating in the search that the Persians are conducting for a new queen, understand that this was no American Idol or Survivor type of reality show where people voluntarily become contestants to win a prize. When the verse states that Esther was taken to the king's palace, understand that she was taken in the most literal sense of the phrase. As a beautiful young virgin, she had no choice but to comply with the men who were sent out to take beautiful young virgins back to the palace. I imagine that this was a very scary time in the life of Esther. But notice in verse 9 how God provides for Esther when she's placed under the custodian of women. It says, "Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of women." Now, I have an interesting little thing here that I can't explain. But back in chapter 1, we saw that King Ahasuerus sent 7 eunuchs to fetch Queen Vashti during the 7 days feast. Then he summoned 7 advisors to take counsel about what to do with Vashti. Now here, in the 7th year of King Ahasuerus' reign, we see that 7 maidservants are given to Esther by Haggai. I can't explain it, I just thought it was neat. Now, in verse 10, it says, "Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it." Understand that the Jews are not the only captives or the only people still in Persia at this point. They're surrounded by their previous enemies that were their previous neighbors in Israel. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. This must have been a pretty bad time for Mordecai as well. But now get this. Each young woman's turn came to go into the king Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months of preparation according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. These ladies must have stunk of everything good. Now in verse 13 we see, "Thus prepared, each young woman went into the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In that evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her." Now, although it doesn't specifically say so in the word here, I believe that we are getting a little peek into the nature of Esther's faith and trust in God. Instead of putting her faith in some object that she might bring in before the king in order to impress the king, instead she sought out and followed the advice of Haggai, someone who would give good advice in this situation, and then she left the rest to God. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 20 states, "He who heeds the word wisely will find good, and whoever trusts in the Lord, happy is he." Now I already mentioned that this book does not mention prayer at all. And I really wish that we might have seen Esther taking her situation before God here. It doesn't mean that she didn't. Because if we had seen her do this, then we would see the 3 elements that we as Christians need to practice when God has us in a situation that is foreign to us or completely out of our control, perhaps even threatening to us. These 3 elements are, First, we need to invite God into the situation and bathe it in prayer. Second, we need to be willing to seek advice or put in the proper legwork ourselves. For example, if a pipe bursts in your house, you are eventually probably going to need to call a plumber rather than just sit by the pipe gushing out water and pray for a miracle. And third, we need to put trust in God. Philippians chapter 4, verses 12 through 13 states, and this is how Paul himself is portraying this type of faith in God. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And if you, having accepted Christ as your Savior, are willing to put your trust in God and lift up your needs in prayer and be willing to do the things that you need to do in that situation, then you too will be able to state, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Let's move on to 16. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. So now we have went to from Queen Vashti to Queen Esther. And next week, we're going to see just how God is going to begin to use this queen. Let's end in prayer. Dear Lord, I just thank you for your word. And I pray, Lord, that we'd be able to go out from here and just be lights for you, Lord. That you'd be working in our lives, that we'd be able to put our trust in you and be willing just to give up the things of this world, Lord, that seem to grow like weeds around us and choke out our walks with you, Lord. So I just ask and pray, Lord, that you please would just help us to go forth this week and to love others like you love us, Lord. Thank you so much. There's in Jesus, amen.